He had just buried 10,000 soldiers. He had just buried the woman he loved. And now his council wanted him to stand in a perfumed hall and choose from 7 trembling women dressed in white, like offerings on an altar. The Alpha King walked in. He looked at the line, and he roared. Chapter 1. The Shadow That Shouldn't Have Moved. The great hall of Valethorn smelled of candle wax, crushed roses, and fear. Senna had been on her knees for 2 hours, not in prayer, in work. The marble floor near the base of the eastern column was her assignment for the morning, a stretch of pale stone that caught boot prints badly and had to be buffed by hand because the head housekeeper, a thin-lipped woman everyone called Mistress Fran, believed that machines left streaks, so Senna knelt and rubbed, and made herself as invisible as she had spent the last 3 years learning to be. She was good at invisible. She had arrived at Valethorn Palace the winter after the war ended, carrying a forged letter of recommendation, a name that was not her birth name, and the particular kind of stillness that comes from surviving something no one is supposed to survive. She had been assigned to the eastern corridor first, then the lower kitchens, then, by a quiet sequence of careful, unremarkable reliability, to the great hall itself, which was considered a position of quiet prestige among the household staff. She had not sought the prestige. She had sought the proximity. The great hall was where the king held audience, where his advisors gathered, where, if you were a girl on her knees buffing marble with a cloth, and no one looked at you, and you could hear everything. This morning, however, the hall was not being used for audience. This morning, the hall had been transformed. 7 pedestals draped in gold cloth stood in a line down the center of the room. On each pedestal, a small arrangement of white flowers, the bloom of the claiming ritual, Senna had heard the other maids say. 7 high-born daughters from 7 allied houses, brought to Valethorn for the formal presentation. The naming, they called it. The council had arranged it. The council had been arranging it for 6 months, ever since the king returned from the Northern Front, a changed man, and refused every diplomatic summons, every dinner, every carefully engineered social occasion designed to remind him that a king without an heir was a kingdom without a future. The council had run out of patience. Senna had watched them run out of it. From her place on the floor, from behind columns, from the quiet margins of rooms where no one thought to look. She pressed her cloth against the marble and kept her eyes down as the 7 women were led in. She heard their shoes, soft slippers, most of them, 1 pair with a slight click at the heel. She heard the rustling of their gowns, the barely suppressed intakes of breath, the way the air in the room changed when anticipation reached a certain pitch. She did not look up. She was very, very careful about when she looked up. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened. Not knocked, not announced, opened, with the particular force of someone who had never in his life been required to wait for permission to enter his own rooms. King Darien walked in, and Senna knew his footsteps by now. She had spent 3 years learning them the way you learn the sound of weather, because weather determines what kind of day you will survive. His steps were even, unhurried, and heavy in a way that had nothing to do with his boots and everything to do with what he carried. He walked like a man who had decided the floor owed him nothing, and he owed it less. She kept her eyes on the marble. She heard him stop. She heard the silence that followed, the kind of silence a room makes when it is holding its breath. Then his voice came, and it was not a voice. It was something older than a voice. It was the sound of a man who had held something compressed inside his chest for so long that when it finally came out, it came out as a physical force. "I don't want your virgins." The words hit the walls and came back, or one of the women made a small sound. A stifled gasp or a sob, it was impossible to tell. Senna heard the head council advisor, Lord Ernest, begin a sentence that didn't survive its first word. "Take them away," the king said, quieter now, which was somehow worse. "All of them. I will not do this." "Your Grace," I said, "take them away." Senna heard the shuffling begin, the quiet, urgent herding of 7 young women toward the side door. She heard Lord Ernest trying again, the careful political voice of a man deciding which argument to deploy. She heard Lady Fran, Not Mistress Fran, this was the other one, Lady Judith, the king's senior chamberlain, stepped forward with something placating. She heard all of it, and she kept her eyes on the floor and her cloth moving in slow, even circles, because she was no one. Oh, she was a seam in the wallpaper. She was the marble itself. Then the footsteps stopped. Directly stopped. As in, they had been moving, crossing the room in the direction of the side corridor. And then they simply ceased. Mid-stride, the way a man stops when something registers that his mind hasn't named yet. Senna's hand slowed on the cloth. She did not look up. She did not breathe. There is someone behind that column. His voice was different now. Not the roar, not the commanded dismissal. Something else. Quieter, more deliberate, and more dangerous for both qualities combined. No one answered him. I said, and the footsteps resumed, not toward the door, but toward her, toward the eastern column, toward the 6 square feet of marble floor she had been assigned and had foolishly stayed on. There is someone behind this column. Step out. Senna set down her cloth. She stood slowly, because moving quickly would be worse, and she stepped out from behind the column with her hands loose at her sides and her face arranged into the expression she had practiced for exactly this kind of moment. Calm, plain, unremarkable. The face of a woman who had nothing to hide because there was nothing interesting enough about her to bother hiding. She looked at the floor. Look at me. She looked up. King Darien stood 8 feet away. He was still in his traveling clothes. He had ridden in from the eastern garrison that morning, and no one had apparently managed to redirect him to his chambers before the council steered him into the hall. His coat was dark, plain, road-worn. There was a long, healed scar along his left jaw that she had memorized from a distance long before this moment. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't recognize, but is certain he should. Who are you? A maid, Your Grace. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. I was assigned to the east corridor floor. I apologize for the intrusion. I'll finish at another time. She bent to pick up her cloth and her small pail. I didn't say you could go. She straightened. He was still looking at her with that expression, not the rage from moments ago, not the grief she had catalogued from across rooms for 3 years. Something she had no word for. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition, even though they had never spoken a word. What is your name? Senna, Your Grace. Senna what? A half-second. Barely perceptible. Senna Vale. That was the false name. The name on the forged letter. The name she had answered to for 3 years without flinching. She did not flinch now. He studied her for another moment. Then he said, with no particular emphasis, as though the words were simply an observation rather than a command. You will come to the war room at midday. Your Grace, I am a maid, yes. His eyes did not move from her face. Midday, Senna. He turned and walked out of the hall. The silence he left behind was enormous. Senna stood with her cloth in one hand and her pail in the other, and she kept her expression exactly where she needed it, and she waited until the last footstep had faded and the last council member had filed out behind him, whispering furiously to each other. Then she looked down. Her hand, at the one holding the cloth, was not entirely steady. She pressed it flat against her side. Midday. The war room. The room where the map of the northern front was pinned to the wall. The room where, if she stood close enough to the right table, she would see the valley her father had been accused of surrendering. She had not come to Valethorn to be noticed. She had come for the truth, and now the king himself had just opened the door. Chapter 2. The War Room. The eastern corridor was empty by the time Senna reached it. She had 40 minutes before midday. She used 30 of them standing at the small basin in the maid's quarters, pressing a cold, wet cloth against the back of her neck the way her mother used to when Senna was a child running fevers she was too stubborn to admit to. The cold helped. It always helped. It gave her body something real to respond to, so her mind could settle into the work of thinking clearly. She needed to think very clearly. She changed into a clean uniform, the standard gray of the palace household staff, high collar, plain cuffs, and she pinned her dark hair back with the 2 copper pins she owned, and she looked at herself in the small square of mirror above the basin. "You are Senna Vale," she told the reflection. "You have always been Senna Vale. You grew up in the southern provinces. Your mother was a seamstress. Your father was nobody." The reflection looked back at her, unconvinced. She went to the war room. 2 guards stood at the door. They looked at her. The gray uniform, the copper pins, the small, unremarkable face of a palace maid, and looked at each other. "The king asked for me," she said. "My name is Senna." One of them knocked. A voice from inside said a single word. The guard opened the door. The war room was larger than she had imagined from the outside. It occupied the entire northeastern corner of the palace's 2nd floor, with windows on 2 walls that let in flat, gray winter light. The walls themselves were lined with shelves, maps in leather tubes, ledgers, wooden cases of surveying instruments. And in the center of the room stood a table the size of a modest dining room, and across its entire surface, weighted at the corners with iron blocks, lay the map. Senna knew this map. She had known it since she was 12 years old, sitting on the floor of her father's study, while he traced the northern front with his finger, and explained to her why rivers mattered more than mountains in a campaign, why supply lines were the real architecture of any war, why the valley at Kern's Pass was the single most critical piece of ground in the entire northern theater. She had spent 3 years imagining this map on this table. She had not imagined that seeing it would feel like this. Like a fist closing around something in her chest, she kept her face still. King Darian was standing at the far end of the table with his back to her, studying a section of the northeastern border. He had changed since the hall. A clean coat now, dark gray, no insignia. His advisor, Lord Ernest, stood to his left with a leather folio tucked under his arm and the expression of a man managing multiple levels of professional displeasure simultaneously. There was one other person in the room, a woman standing near the window with a cup in her hand, watching Senna's entrance with dark, careful eyes. Senna knew her too, from a distance, from corners. Lady Judith Hawley, the king's senior chamberlain, his childhood companion, the court said. The woman who had managed Valethorn's internal affairs for 7 years while the king managed its wars. She was 30, perhaps 31, all with the kind of composed elegance that looked effortless because it had been practiced for so long it had become structural. She was looking at Senna the way a woman looks at something she is deciding how to classify. "You came," the king said without turning. "You told me to, Your Grace. I tell a great many people a great many things." He turned now. In the flat winter light of the war room, he looked older than 32, which was his age. Senna knew his age, she knew a great many things about him, and more tired, not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept, the deeper kind. "Not all of them come." Senna said nothing. He gestured at the map. "Come here." She crossed the room and stood at the table's edge. For a moment she simply looked at the map, and the map looked back at her, and she felt the fist in her chest tighten 1 additional degree. Kern's Pass. There it was, marked in red the way contested ground was always marked, a notation beside it in small, precise script that she was not close enough to read. "My supply route from the eastern garrison to the Kern's Pass garrison," the king said, pointing to a line running northeast across the map. "According to my logistics master, it takes 11 days. My own records suggest it should take 8. Tell me why there is a 3-day discrepancy." Senna looked at the route. "That's not the reason," she said. Ernest made a sound beside her. The king's finger stilled on the map. "I beg your pardon?" "The 3-day discrepancy isn't a logistics problem." She pointed, not touching the map, just indicating with her finger above it. "Oh, your route crosses Aldrich's Ridge here. In winter, the northern face of that ridge is impassable after the first frost because the runoff from the snowmelt creates a false road. It looks solid from a distance, but the ground underneath is saturated. Any supply train crossing it after mid-autumn will either slow to half-speed navigating around the soft patches or lose 2 days pulling a wagon out of the mud. That's your 3 days." The room was quiet. She became aware, belatedly, that she had just spoken to the King of Valethorn about his military logistics as though she were correcting a student's arithmetic. She kept her eyes on the map. How do you know what the northern face of that ridge looks like in winter? His voice was not angry. It was something more careful than angry. I grew up near the southern approach to the pass, Your Grace. It was not entirely a lie. She had grown up near it, in a house with a study full of maps and a father who believed that knowing ground was the beginning of all military thinking, and who had taught his daughter to read terrain before she could read letters. The king looked at her for a long moment. What's the alternate route? She pointed. Here. The valley road adds half a day in distance, but the ground is stable year-round. You'd recover the 3 days and arrive with a supply train that hasn't lost a wheel. Ernest cleared his throat. Your Grace, I hardly think it's appropriate to— Lord Ernest. The king's voice was quiet. Please go and find out why my logistics master has been sending supply trains over a frozen ridge for 3 winters. Ernest pressed his lips together. He tucked his folio more firmly under his arm, executed a precise bow, and left. The door closed. The room was now Senna, the king, and Lady Judith, who had not moved from the window and had not stopped watching. Senna Vale, the king said, as though testing the name for weight. From the southern approach to Kern's Pass. Yes, Your Grace. Who is your father? The cold came back, not the useful clarifying cold of the basin cloth, but the cold that lived in the specific place where fear and grief were stored together. A farmer, Your Grace. He died 4 years ago. I'm sorry. She had not expected him to say that. It landed somewhere unguarded, and she felt the impact of it more than she wanted to. Thank you, she said, because there was nothing else to say. He turned back to the map. He was quiet for a moment, studying the valley road she had indicated, and she had the sense he was not really looking at the map anymore but at something further away, some calculation she was not privy to. You may go, he said finally. She turned. Senna. She stopped. Tomorrow. Same time. It was not a question. She had already learned that he did not ask questions when he had already decided on the answer. Yes, Your Grace, she said. She left. In the corridor outside, she walked exactly 12 paces before she stopped, turned to face the wall, and pressed both palms flat against the cold stone. Her father's name was not Aldrich the farmer. Her father's name was General Aldrich Vale, and the ridge she had just redirected the king's supply route around bore his name because he had mapped it, surveyed it, and documented its winter instability in a military report 20 years ago, a report that was now sitting, she suspected, in one of those leather tubes on the shelves inside the war room. The king had a map drawn by her father's hands, in a room he had just asked her to return to. And he did not know. She pushed off the wall and walked. Behind her, in the war room she had just left, Lady Judith set down her cup and looked at the door for a long, measuring moment. Then she picked up her pen. If you're wondering what's in that letter Judith is writing, so is Senna. Chapter 3 is where the walls of this palace start closing in. Chapter 3, what the walls remember. 3 days passed before Senna understood that she was being watched, not by the king, by Judith. It was subtle at first, the kind of subtle that only registers if you have spent years training yourself to notice things that aren't meant to be noticed. A maid reassigned from the eastern corridor without explanation, replaced by a girl Senna had never seen before, who moved too slowly and watched too much. A small delay in Senna's morning task assignments, nothing dramatic, just enough to mean that Mistress Fran was receiving her instructions from someone above the usual chain. On the 3rd morning, Senna found her pail moved. She had left it beside the column. It was now 6 feet to the left, near the window. Nobody moved Maid's pails. There was no reason to move a maid's pail unless someone had been standing where it was, and had moved it without thinking, because they were standing there long enough to find it inconvenient. Someone had been standing at her column, looking at whatever a person standing at that column would look at, which was the door to the war room. Senna picked up her pail, relocated it back to the column, and went to work. The second war room meeting had been different from the first. The king had been alone this time. No Ernest, no Judith. He had been standing at the table when she arrived, already mid-thought, already pointing at something on the map before she had fully crossed the room, as though continuing a conversation that had been running in his head since she left. "The Valley Road," he said. "I sent a rider." "Well, you were right about the ground stability." She said nothing. "You could have said I told you so." "I don't find that useful, Your Grace." Something moved briefly across his face, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. He looked back at the map. They had worked for an hour. Not formally. He asked things, she answered. He indicated sections of the map. She told him what she knew about the terrain. He tested her twice with questions she recognized as tests, asking about ground she knew he already had accurate information on. She gave him the accurate information both times. He did not acknowledge the tests directly, but his questions afterward became less careful, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. At the end of the hour, he had said, "Tomorrow." And she had come tomorrow, and the day after. This was now the 5th meeting, and then somewhere between the 1st and the 5th, something had shifted in the texture of the room. The questions had become less strictly military. He had asked her once how she navigated the palace when she first arrived. Not suspiciously, more as a man who was curious about how other people solved problems. She had answered carefully. He had listened in the complete way she had noticed he did everything, as though the conversation had his full attention and the rest of the world could wait. She had found that quality deeply inconvenient. It was easier to study a man from a distance. Distance made him a project, a purpose, something she was moving toward in careful, calculated increments. Up close, he was a person. On the 5th morning, she arrived to find the war room occupied by 3 people she had not seen before. 2 military advisors in campaign coats and a cartographer with ink-stained fingers who was unrolling a new survey across the end of the table. The king was in the middle of a disagreement. She stepped inside, assessed the room in 2 seconds, and moved to the far corner without being asked, making herself quiet and peripheral while he finished. The disagreement was about the Kearns Pass garrison, specifically about whether to maintain it through winter or pull the men back to the secondary fort at the valley floor. The first advisor wanted withdrawal, the second wanted to hold. The cartographer was staying out of it with the focused neutrality of a man who mapped things and preferred not to be asked to have opinions about them. Yet the king listened to both positions. Then he looked across the room at Senna. She felt both advisors look at her. The reflexive, assessing look of men who have just realized that the king's gaze has gone somewhere unexpected. "The garrison at Kearns Pass," Darian said. "If you were holding it through winter, what would you need?" The first advisor made a sound. Senna looked at the map. 40 additional cords of fuel, she said. The standard winter supply calculation doesn't account for the wind exposure at that elevation. The garrison burns through heating fuel at roughly 1.5 times the rate of a sheltered position. You'd also want the secondary water supply line insulated before the first hard frost because the main line freezes at that elevation, and if you're holding through deep winter with a frozen water line, you have a serious problem inside 3 weeks. Silence. "And the access road," she added. "The northern approach gets ice-sealed around the 3rd week of the cold season. You'd want supplies brought up before that, not after, which means moving the resupply timeline forward by approximately 6 weeks from the current schedule." The cartographer had stopped unrolling his survey and was looking at her. "Who is this?" the first advisor said, not rudely, simply with the bluntness of a man who wanted information. "Her name is Senna," the king said. "She knows this terrain." "She's wearing a maid's uniform." "Yes," Darian said, with no particular inflection. "I noticed." The meeting concluded 20 minutes later. The advisors left. The cartographer gathered his materials with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned not to linger in rooms where things were more complicated than maps. When the door closed, the king sat down at the table for the first time in any of their meetings. He did not look tired exactly. He looked like a man who had been standing for so long he had forgotten sitting was an option, and had just remembered. Senna remained standing. "Judith asked me about you this morning," he said. Her hands stayed loose at her sides. "What did she ask?" "Where you came from. What I knew about your family." He looked at the map. "I told her I knew very little." "That's accurate, Your Grace." "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "Judith is thorough. If she's asking me..." She's already looked for the answer herself and found something she wanted to confirm." Senna said nothing. He looked up. Is there anything you want to tell me? The room held the question. She thought about her father's survey reports in their leather tubes on those shelves. She thought about the ridge that bore his name on a map the king used every day. She thought about what she had come here for, the slow, patient accumulation of access and proximity leading toward the evidence she needed, the records that would show what had actually happened at Kern's Pass in the final week of the war. She thought about the way he had said, "I'm sorry," when she mentioned her father's death, with no performance in it at all. "Not yet," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Not yet," he repeated. Not angry, just noting it. There is something," she said carefully. "But I need to be certain of it before I say it aloud, because once I say it, it cannot be unsaid, and it will matter very much who hears it, and in what order." He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. She had not expected him to accept that. In her 3 years of watching him from corners, she had catalogued him as many things: difficult, contained, occasionally frightening in his stillness, but not patient, not the accepting kind of patient. "You'll tell me when you're certain," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." "And if Judith finds it first?" Senna met his eyes. "Then I'll tell you before she does." He nodded once. She understood that the meeting was over, and she turned toward the door. "Senna." She stopped. It was becoming a pattern. Him saying her name at the door, or her stopping. She was going to have to think carefully about what that pattern meant. "The fuel calculation," he said. 40 cords. You arrived at that number quickly." "Yes." "How?" "A half-beat. The briefest half-beat she could manage." "I grew up watching someone plan for winter, Your Grace. You learn to calculate the things that will kill you if you get them wrong." She left before he could ask anything else. In the corridor, she walked quickly to the servants' staircase and descended 2 floors and turned into the narrow passageway that ran behind the east kitchen wall, and she stood there in the dark and the smell of wood smoke, and she thought about 40 cords of winter fuel and a man who had taught her to calculate them, General Aldrich Vale, her father, the man this king believed had betrayed him. She pressed her back against the wall. She needed the records. She needed what was in those leather tubes. She needed proof before Judith's letter, whatever it said, wherever it had gone, came back with an answer that named her. She had perhaps a week, maybe less. The name her father carried as a traitor, Senna knows the truth behind it, but the proof she needs is inside the war room, on shelves she isn't supposed to touch. Chapter 4 is where she finds something far more dangerous than records. Chapter 4, the Memorial Wing. She found the records on a Wednesday, not in the war room, in the archive. The palace archive occupied the entire sublevel beneath the Eastern Library, a low-ceilinged, cold-floored series of rooms that smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular stillness of things that had not been disturbed in a long time. It was staffed by one archivist, a small, precise, elderly man named Albert, who wore the same brown coat every day and had the quality of a man who had outlasted 4 administrations by being consistently, unthreateningly useful. Senna had identified Albert 3 months into her time at Valethorn. She had spent the following months being quietly helpful to him, returning misplaced items to their correct location, noting when a shelf was developing a moisture problem, once spending an entire afternoon helping him recatalog a section of territorial survey maps that had been misfiled sometime in the previous decade. Albert trusted her, in the particular way that very organized people trust others who respect organization. He did not question her when she came to the archive on Wednesday morning with a requisition slip, signed, stamped, entirely forged, requesting access to the Northern Campaign survey records for the purpose of cross-referencing current logistics routes. He simply led her to the correct section, indicated the relevant tubes, and returned to his desk. Senna pulled the first tube. Inside, rolled tightly around a wooden dowel, was her father's handwriting. She had not seen it in 4 years, and she pressed her fingers flat against the paper for a moment, just a moment, and then she made herself read. The records took 2 hours. When she was done, she sat back on her heels on the archive floor and looked at the wall and breathed carefully through the thing that was happening in her chest. It was all there. Every survey report her father had filed in the 6 months before the Battle of Kern's Pass. Every supply calculation, every terrain assessment, every warning. And there were warnings, multiple warnings, filed through the correct channels, documented in triplicate the way her father documented everything, about the instability of the northern approach road in autumn, about the timing of the enemy's eastern flank movement, about the critical importance of holding the secondary fort at the valley floor as a fallback position. The warnings had been received. She could see the receipt stamps, she could see the dates, and then she found the falsified dispatch. It was filed under her father's name, with his seal, but the handwriting was wrong. She knew her father's handwriting the way she knew her own face. The letters were close, carefully close. The forgery was skilled, but the way he formed the letter K was wrong, and the spacing between words was wrong, and the date on the document was 3 days after her father had already been captured by enemy forces at the valley floor. A dispatch, supposedly from General Aldrich Weil, ordering the retreat from Kern's Pass, filed 3 days after he was physically incapable of filing anything. As someone inside Valethorn had written it. Someone inside Valethorn had surrendered Kern's Pass and put her father's name on the order. And 10,000 soldiers and the king's betrothed had died in the collapse that followed. Senna rolled the documents carefully back into their tubes. She replaced every tube exactly as she had found it. She thanked Albert on her way out. She walked up the stairs and through the east corridor and past the column with the moved pail and up to the maid's quarters, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and she did not move for a very long time. She had known. She had suspected, had believed with the conviction of a daughter who knew her father, but believing and knowing were different countries, and she had just crossed the border. Someone in this palace had murdered her father's name, and someone in this palace was still here. She almost missed her midday summons. She arrived at the war room 3 minutes late, which had never happened before. The king noted it with a single look and said nothing. He was not alone. A woman was sitting in the chair near the window. Not Judith, someone Senna had not seen in the war room before. Young, perhaps 20, with the careful posture of someone who had been taught to sit correctly and had not yet decided whether she believed in it. Brown hair, quiet eyes, a small scar at the corner of her left eyebrow that she made no effort to conceal. "This is Flora," the king said. "She arrived this morning from the northern province. She'll be staying in the palace for the foreseeable future." Flora looked at Senna with a directness that was not unfriendly, but was very alert. Flora," Senna said, nodding. "You're the maid who knows about terrain," Flora said. "I know a little. Darian says you corrected his supply route." The king's jaw shifted very slightly at the casual use of his name, not irritated, more like a man who had given up on a particular battle a long time ago. "Flora is my cousin," he said to Senna by way of explanation. That reoriented the room somewhat. "She'll be observing the morning sessions when her schedule permits," he said. "I'd like her to understand the northern terrain before spring." Senna nodded. She filed Flora away. Not a threat, not an ally yet, but present, and present people saw things. The session that followed was the longest they had yet had. The king was in a different kind of focus today. Not the contained, careful attention of a man managing something, but something more open, almost restless, like a problem he was circling from multiple directions. He asked about the valley floor, about the secondary fort, about the last week of the campaign. Each question was a step closer to the thing she was carrying, and she answered each one carefully, giving him the terrain, the geography, the neutral facts of ground and weather, and not the things she knew about the falsified dispatch, because she was not certain yet of the safest sequence of telling it, and because Flora was in the room, and because she needed one more piece before she spoke. She needed to know whose handwriting it was. Near the end of the session, she was standing close to the shelves, naturally, unremarkably close, because the conversation had moved to the eastern boundary surveys, and the relevant tubes were on the third shelf. She was reading the handwriting on the labels. Most were in the cartographer's script. Some were in an older hand she didn't recognize. 2 were in the cramped angular script of Lord Ernest. And then, on a requisition log tacked to the inside of the shelf door, she found it. A notation, dated 14 months before the Battle of Kern's Pass. The same letter K, the same word spacing. The name at the bottom of the notation was not Lord Ernest. It was Judith Hawley. She was still processing this when the king dismissed the session, and Flora stood to leave, and Senna turned toward the door, and she nearly walked directly into Judith, who was standing in the doorway with a cup of something warm and an expression of perfect pleasantness. "Senna," Judith said, "I've been meaning to speak with you." Flora slipped past them both into the corridor. Senna waited. "I've written to a contact in the southern provinces," Judith said, her voice conversational, warm, entirely controlled. "Regarding your family history, I should have a response within the week." She took a sip from her cup. "I wanted you to know, so you're not caught off guard." She smiled. It was a kind smile. That was the worst part of it. It was genuinely warm, the smile of a woman who believed she was doing the right thing. "Thank you for telling me," Senna said. She meant it, actually. She meant it completely. Because now she had her timeline. 1 week, possibly less. She walked to the door. Judith stepped aside pleasantly to let her pass, and Senna went to find the king. Not tomorrow, not at midday, now. She knows who forged the dispatch, she knows who sent the letter, and she's walking toward the one man she cannot afford to trust, and cannot afford not to. Chapter 5 is the conversation that changes everything between them. Chapter 5, the thing neither of them named. She found him in the memorial wing. She had not looked for him there deliberately. She had gone first to the war room, found it empty, then to his private study, where his attendant told her with the careful blankness of a man relaying information he found unusual that the king had gone to the east corridor of the upper floor and had asked not to be disturbed. The east corridor of the upper floor was where the memorial wing was. Senna stood outside the door for a moment. She had cleaned this corridor before. She knew what was inside. She had seen it through the half-open door on 3 separate mornings, always empty, always with the particular stillness of a room that was being preserved rather than lived in. A sitting room, furnished in pale blue, a writing desk near the window, a portrait on the far wall of a young woman with light hair and a direct, unguarded expression that the painter had either been very skilled or very honest to capture. Lady Erin, the king's betrothed, dead at 23 in the collapse at Kern's Pass. Senna pushed the door open. He was sitting in the chair beside the writing desk, not looking at the portrait, looking at his hands. He had his elbows on his knees, and his head slightly forward, and he looked like a man who had come here to think, and had found, as he apparently often did, that thinking led him somewhere he hadn't intended. He looked up when she entered. She expected him to send her away. He didn't. "You're not supposed to be in this wing," he said, not angrily, almost tiredly. "No," she agreed. She stepped inside and left the door half open behind her, and because a fully closed door would be something, and she wasn't ready for it to be something. "I need to speak with you. It couldn't wait until tomorrow." He straightened slowly. He looked at her face, the careful reading look she had come to recognize, the one that meant he was deciding how much weight to give what he was seeing. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room held them both in its pale blue stillness, and the portrait looked down from the wall, and somewhere in the palace below them, life was going on at its normal pace, the kitchens, the corridors, the afternoon business of a working household. And none of it reached this room. "You came here to tell me the thing you weren't certain of yet," he said. "Yes." "You're certain now?" "Yes." He waited. Senna looked at her hands for a moment, not because she needed composure, but because she needed to choose the right beginning, the sequence that would give him the truth, in the order that would let him receive it. "The Battle of Kern's Pass," she said. "The retreat order. The one filed under General Aldrich Vale's name." His stillness changed. It became a different kind of stillness. "That retreat order was forged," she said. "It was filed 3 days after the general had already been captured at the valley floor. He could not have written it. The handwriting doesn't match his, and I have found the hand it does match." Silence. "The same handwriting," she continued, "appears on a requisition notation in your war room archive, dated 14 months before the battle. It belongs to Lady Judith Hawley." The room was very quiet, as Darian did not move. He did not speak. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not rage, not grief, something colder and more careful than either. The expression of a man whose mind was running very fast beneath a completely still surface. "You have seen this documentation," he said. His voice was measured. "Yes, in the archive. The survey tubes filed under the Northern Campaign. Your father's archivist cataloged everything. It's all there. The original reports, the receipt stamps, the falsified dispatch." She paused. "And the general's warnings. He filed 6 separate warnings about the northern approach road and the timing of the eastern flank movement. They were received, they were stamped, they were never acted on." "Because they were intercepted," Darian said. "Not a question." I believe so." He stood. He did not pace. He simply stood, as though sitting had become structurally insufficient. He turned toward the window. Outside, the winter light was going thin and gray, the way it did in the middle of the afternoon when the clouds came down. "Judith," he said, just the name, flat, without inflection. "Your Grace, how long have you known?" "I confirmed it this morning. I have suspected it longer." She kept her voice even. "I told you I needed to be certain before I said it aloud." "Yes." He turned back to face her. "You did say that." She held his gaze. "Who else knows you're here?" he asked. "No one." "Flora?" "No." He nodded slowly. He was thinking. She could see the shape of it, the way his focus had turned inward and was working through implications and sequences the way he worked through map problems. It was the same mind, applied to a different kind of terrain. "Judith told me this morning that she had written to a contact regarding my background," Senna said. "She said she expected a response within the week. She was warning you. She was giving me the chance to leave." Senna paused. "She believes that if I'm gone, the question of what I know leaves with me." "Does she know what you found in the archive?" "Not yet. But she will begin to suspect it as soon as she realizes I didn't take the opportunity to disappear." He looked at her for a long moment. "Senna Vale," he said. "That's not your name." It was not a question. She had known this moment was coming. She had rehearsed 20 versions of it, and none of them felt adequate now that it had arrived. "No," she said. "Tell me your name." "Senna Vale is the name I arrived here with, and it's the name I've used for 3 years." She kept her eyes on his. "My birth name is Senna Aldrich. The general was my father." The room absorbed this. Darian stood very still. She watched him receive it, the full weight of it, the 3 years, the forged letter of recommendation, the false name, the archive, all of it arriving at once and rearranging itself into a single coherent picture. "You came here for this," he said. "You've been here 3 years. You came to find proof." "Yes." "You cleaned my floors for 3 years to clear your father's name." "Yes." He turned away again. She let him. She sat with the truth between them, out in the open now, and she did not try to soften it or supplement it with explanation because the truth did not need accompaniment. It was what it was. When he turned back, his expression had changed. The cold calculation was still there, but underneath it something had shifted. Something that looked, in the pale light of this pale blue room, uncomfortably like grief. "Aaron died in the collapse," he said. "I know. If the retreat order had not been filed, the pass would have held. The eastern flank would have been contained. The engagement would have been costly but survivable." She said it quietly. "My father knew that. He died knowing that his name was on an order he never gave, for a collapse he spent 6 months trying to prevent." Darian said nothing. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Senna said. "He doesn't need your forgiveness. He needs his name back." Something moved across his face, quick, unguarded, gone before she could fully read it. "And if I'd known who you were," he said, you would never have gotten close enough to tell me this." "No, I wouldn't have." "So the 3 years were necessary." Yes. He looked at her. Looked at her in the direct, complete way he had, the way that made distance impossible, and said nothing for a long moment. I believe you, he said at last. She had not known, until he said it, how much she had needed to hear it. It landed somewhere deep and structural, like a foundation stone being set in ground that had been hollow for 4 years. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. He crossed toward the door. I need to verify what you found before I move on Judith. If I'm wrong, if there's another explanation, I need to know that before I act. He paused at the door. You'll say nothing to anyone, not Flora, or not anyone in the household. Of course. And Senna. He stopped. He did not turn around fully, just enough that she could see the edge of his profile against the doorframe. You could have left when she warned you, this morning. You could have walked out of this palace, and I would never have known what you'd found. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? She thought about the basin cloth and the cold water. She thought about her father's handwriting on a survey map, careful and precise, naming a ridge for the stability of the ground beneath it. Because the truth doesn't become less true because it's inconvenient to carry, she said. Someone has to bring it to the right room. He left. Senna sat alone in the pale blue room with the portrait of Aaron looking down from the wall, and she thought about what had just happened, and then she thought about the way his voice had changed when he said, I believe you, and she pressed both hands flat on her knees and told herself very firmly that this was not the time. It was not the time. She stood. She straightened her uniform. She walked out of the memorial wing and down the corridor and back to her work. She passed Judith in the east hallway. Judith smiled at her pleasantly. Senna smiled back. Neither of them said a word. She told him everything. He believed her. But believing her and protecting her are two different things, and what's coming for Senna in Chapter 6 cannot be stopped by the truth alone. Chapter 6. They sent someone for her, at the 5th hour. The investigation began quietly. That was Darian's way, she was learning. He did not announce his intentions. He simply began moving pieces, and the pieces moved, and by the time anyone noticed the shape of what was happening, it was already too late to rearrange the board. She knew the investigation had started because Albert came to find her. He appeared at the eastern corridor on Thursday morning with his brown coat and his careful eyes, and told her in the low, precise voice of a man who chose every word deliberately that someone had requisitioned the Northern Campaign survey records overnight. The original tubes, Albert said. Not copies. The requisition came through the King's seal. Thank you, Albert, she said. He nodded once and went back to his archive. She kept buffing the floor. Flora found her at lunch. This was new. Flora had been at the palace 4 days and had not yet established any particular pattern of movement that Senna had observed, which meant either she was genuinely unpredictable or she was trying to appear so. Senna had not yet decided which. She arrived at the small side table in the servants' hall where Senna ate, always the same corner, always facing the door, and sat down across from her with a plate of bread and cold meat and the direct, uncalculating expression that seemed to be simply how her face worked. Judith asked me about you this morning, Flora said. Senna looked up from her bowl. She asked how well I knew you, how much time we'd spent together in the war room sessions. Flora tore a piece of bread. Oh, she was very pleasant about it. What did you tell her? That we'd spoken perhaps 3 times and that you knew a great deal about terrain. Flora looked at her steadily. Which is true. Yes. She seemed interested in whether you and Darian spoke privately. Senna said nothing. I told her I had no idea, Flora said. Which is also true. I don't know what happens in that room when I'm not there. She paused. But I'm reasonably good at reading rooms, and when I'm in that one, the air has a quality that suggests the conversations that happen when I'm absent are different in kind from the ones that happen when I'm present. Senna looked at the young woman across from her. The quiet eyes, the scar, the directness that had apparently been present since birth. Why are you telling me this? Senna asked. Because Judith is thorough, and you don't have anyone in this palace who is openly on your side, and I thought you should know she's asking questions in multiple directions. Flora took a bite of bread and chewed it thoughtfully. Also because I liked how you handled the supply route correction. You were right, and you said so without making anyone feel stupid about being wrong. That's a skill most people don't bother developing. Senna looked at her for a moment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Just don't get yourself killed. Flora stood, picked up her plate. I'd find the war room sessions considerably less interesting without you. She left. Senna sat with her bowl and thought about the shape of the board as it currently stood. Darian had the archive records. Judith knew time was running out. Flora was watching, and Albert was watching. The unnamed contact in the southern provinces would have a response within the week, and when that response came back with the name Aldrich attached to a maid currently living in the palace, Judith would stop being pleasant and start being something else. Senna needed to move faster than the letter. She went to the king that afternoon, not to the war room, to the study, where his attendant now admitted her without the careful pause that had characterized the first week. She was becoming, she noticed with complicated feelings, a known quantity in the king's daily schedule. Darian was at his desk with 3 documents in front of him, and the look of a man who had been reading for several hours and had arrived at conclusions he did not enjoy. He looked up when she came in. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I've had 2 of my most trusted men in the archive since last night," he said. "Not Ernest, men outside the immediate council. They've confirmed what you found." He set the documents aside. "The dispatch is a forgery. The original warnings are all there, receipt-stamped and unacted upon. The timeline is exactly as you described." Senna nodded. "I also found 3 additional documents," he said, "that you may not have seen. Supply requisitions from the week before the battle. Specific materials ordered through Judith's office. Materials that would have been consistent with preparing a secondary position, a fallback, as though someone knew the pass was going to fall and was arranging accordingly." She had not found those. She had been working quickly, alert to Albert's movements, not reading every document in the section. She planned it, Senna said. Not a question. "She planned it," he confirmed. The room was quiet. "Your Grace." She kept her voice even. "Judith has been asking questions about me through multiple channels. Flora told me this morning that she's inquiring about our private conversations. She has a contact in the southern provinces who will connect my face to my father's name within days." She paused. "When that happens, she will reframe everything I've told you. She'll tell you I came here with an agenda, that everything I found was constructed, that I manufactured the evidence to protect my father's legacy and manipulate you in the process." "I know," he said, "and some part of the council will believe her, because she has been here 7 years and I have been here 3, and wearing a false name and a maid's uniform." "I know that too." He stood and moved to the window, the same movement she had seen him make in the memorial wing when thinking became too large to manage sitting down. "I'm moving against her before the letter comes back," he said. "Tomorrow morning. I'm calling a closed council session and presenting the archive evidence." He turned. "But I need you there." She looked at him. "Not as a maid," he said, "as a witness, as the person who found the documentation and can speak to its content and its implications." He paused. "Which means the false name ends. Your actual identity becomes part of the record." "I understand." "You'll be exposed as the general's daughter. Everything you did to stay hidden for 3 years becomes public knowledge." "I understand that too." "It may not go cleanly," he said. "Even with the evidence. There are council members who have been comfortable with the accepted version of what happened at Kern's Pass. Disrupting that version disrupts them." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. The steady, complete attention she had stopped trying to be unaffected by. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm terrified," she said. "But it's not the same thing." Something shifted in his expression. Something she had seen once before, briefly in the memorial wing, when she had said her father's name aloud. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, closer than the map table, closer than the war room doorframe, and close enough that she could see the long-healed scar along his jaw clearly, and the specific quality of exhaustion in his eyes that was not tiredness, but history. "Senna," he said. Her name in his voice had changed. She didn't know when that had happened. "Yes," she said. He reached out and did something entirely unexpected. He straightened the collar of her uniform, a small, precise gesture. His fingers barely touched the fabric. It was the kind of thing a person does when they need to do something with their hands, and the only honest thing available is a small, practical act of care. He stepped back. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "6th hour. Come to the council chamber." He returned to his desk. "And Senna, tonight, stay inside. Don't go anywhere in the palace alone." She stood. "You think she'll act tonight?" "I think she's been in this palace for 7 years, and she is not stupid." He looked at the documents on his desk. "And I think she knows the session is coming, even if she doesn't know the exact timing. People in long positions of power develop instincts about when the ground is shifting." Senna nodded. She was at the door when he said it, quietly, not looking up from the documents, as though it were simply an additional item on a list. "I'm glad you didn't leave." She stood at the door with her hand on the frame. "So am I," she said. She meant it. She was surprised by how completely she meant it. She walked back to the maid's quarters. She ate the evening meal in the servants' hall with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. She went to her narrow bed at the 8th hour and lay in the dark listening to the palace settle around her. She did not sleep. At the 2nd hour past midnight, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the maid's quarters. Not the regular footsteps of a night attendant, but the careful, deliberate footsteps of someone trying not to be heard. She was already sitting up. The footsteps stopped outside her door. Then they moved on. She sat in the dark for a long time after that, completely still, listening to the palace breathe. At the 4th hour, she got up, dressed, and moved her small bundle of belongings. The few things that mattered, the copper pins, her mother's ring, the single document she had copied from the archive by memory onto a spare piece of paper, from under her bed to inside her uniform. She sat back down on the edge of the bed. She was ready. She told herself that was enough. The 6th hour is coming. The council chamber is waiting. But someone in this palace has decided that morning is too late, and Senna will never make it to that chamber on her own feet. Chapter 7 is where everything breaks. Chapter 7. What breaks cannot always be rebuilt. She heard them at the 5th hour. Not footsteps this time. Something heavier. The sound of deliberate movement in the servants' corridor below. The kind of organized quiet that a single person does not make. 2 people. Possibly 3. Senna was already dressed. She had been sitting on the edge of her bed since the 4th hour with her belongings inside her uniform, and her mind running through the palace layout the way her father had taught her to run through terrain. Exit points, bottlenecks, the places where a corridor narrowed and a person became predictable. She stood. She did not take the main servant's staircase. She took the linen passage, the narrow vertical shaft behind the east kitchen wall that connected the residential floors to the ground level, through a series of tight landings designed for moving laundry, not people. She had used it once before, on her 3rd week at Valethorn, when she had still been mapping every passageway as a matter of survival habit. She moved quickly and quietly, and without a light. She was 2 floors down when she heard the door to the maid's quarters open above her. She did not stop. She reached the ground level, pushed through the linen passage door into the east kitchen corridor, and turned left toward the main residential wing, the only direction that led toward the king's private guard station rather than away from it. She had covered perhaps 30 feet when the man stepped out of the alcove, and she had no time to stop. She had no time to do anything except register his size and the object in his right hand before he swung it, and she turned her head on instinct so it caught the side of her skull rather than the back, and the corridor tilted sharply, and she went down. She did not lose consciousness entirely. She was aware of the floor against her cheek, cold marble, the same marble she had buffed for 3 years, and the sound of footsteps, 2 sets now, moving quickly toward her from behind. She was aware of a voice, male, low, saying something she couldn't fully resolve through the noise the impact had made in her head. She pushed her palms against the floor. She got one knee under her. The footsteps behind her stopped. Then a third set of footsteps, different in weight, different in pace, and coming from the direction of the main corridor, moving fast. A voice she knew. "Get away from her." Not loud, but the quality of it, the specific, absolute certainty in it, stopped everything in the corridor as completely as a physical wall. Darian. He was still dressed, or dressed again, she couldn't tell, and he had 2 of his private guard with him, the ones who stood outside his personal chambers, not the ceremonial palace guard, but the men who had served with him in the north and moved the way soldiers move. The man with the object in his hand made a decision in approximately 2 seconds and made the wrong one. He ran. The 2 guards went after him. The second set of footsteps, the ones from behind her, had already gone, vanished back into whatever passage they had come from, and the corridor was suddenly empty except for her on the floor, and Darian crossing the remaining distance to where she was. He crouched down. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. The corridor was swimming slightly, but she could see his face. The scar, the exhaustion, something new in his expression that she had no word for and was not in a condition to name. "Can you stand?" "Yes," she said. She was not entirely certain this was true. He put his hand under her arm anyway, and she stood, and it turned out to be mostly true. The floor stayed approximately where it was supposed to be, and after a moment the swimming reduced to a manageable tilt. There was blood. She could feel it at her temple, a warm line running toward her jaw. She pressed the back of her hand against it. "You were awake," she said, yet her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I told you the ground was shifting," he said. He was looking at the blood at her temple with the expression of a man exercising significant restraint over what his face was doing. "I had men watching the residential corridors." "You didn't tell me that." "No." He was still looking at her temple. "I should have." He took the cloth from his own pocket, a plain square, the kind carried without ceremony, and pressed it against the cut himself, because she was still using her hand on it, and he had 2 hands available and apparently had made a decision about which one of them was going to manage this. She let him. His hand was steady. She noticed that specifically, that it was completely steady, which meant whatever he was feeling about this moment, he had put somewhere it wasn't interfering with the practical task. "Your guard will catch him," she said. "Yes. He'll name who sent him." "He will," Darian said, "or he will spend a considerable time in a situation that makes him reconsider his priorities." She almost smiled. The tilt of the floor made her stop. "Lean on the wall," he said. She leaned on the wall. He kept the cloth at her temple, his arm raised, standing close enough that she could see the exact line where exhaustion lived in his face. Not around the eyes, as she had always assumed from a distance, but in the set of his jaw, the very slight forward weight of his shoulders, the posture of a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he had stopped noticing the carrying. She noticed it. She thought about not saying it and said it anyway, because she had established a habit of saying true things, and this moment did not seem like the time to abandon it. "You've been awake all night," she said. "Yes." "Because of the council session." He looked at her directly. "Because of several things." She held his gaze. The corridor was empty and silent and very cold, and his hand was steady against the side of her face, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched beyond its natural length. Then one of his guards returned, breathing hard, footsteps announcing themselves clearly, and the moment folded back into its practical dimensions. "We have him," the guard said. "He's talking." Darian looked at Senna one more time. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then walk with me." They took her to a small room off the main residential corridor, not her quarters, not the war room, a neutral room with a chair and a fire, and the kind of functional plainness that suggested it was used for exactly this kind of middle-of-the-night practicality. A palace physician arrived within minutes, a quiet woman named Donna who examined the cut with brisk efficiency and closed it with 3 small stitches, and told Senna she would have a headache for 2 days. Senna thanked her. Donna left. Flora arrived. She appeared in the doorway in a dressing gown with her hair loose and her eyes entirely awake, looked at the stitches, looked at Darian, and said, "Judith?" with the flatness of someone confirming a thing they had already calculated. "We don't have confirmation yet," Darian said. But you have the man." "Yes." Flora sat down on the edge of the second chair and looked at Senna with something that was not pity, something steadier and more useful than pity. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I will be," Senna said, which was true. She believed it was true. "The council session," Flora said to Darian. "Do you move it up?" "To the 7th hour," he said, "before anyone in this palace has time to regroup." Flora nodded. The man they had caught talked within the hour. He was, it emerged, not a palace employee, but an outside hire, brought in through a private arrangement 3 days prior, housed in the lower town, given a description and a corridor and an instruction. He named his contractor with the speed of a man who had made his calculation and decided that loyalty to an absent employer was not worth what was currently being offered as an alternative. The name he gave was not Judith. It was a man named Raymond, a minor court functionary who had served in Judith's administrative office for 4 years, and who, when the King's Guard arrived at his quarters at the 6th hour, had already packed a bag. He had not yet left. In the session that followed, conducted in the small antechamber rather than the council room, with Raymond sitting very still, and the king standing and Senna present with 3 stitches at her temple, Raymond talked for 45 minutes. He talked about the dispatch, about the forged seal, and about the supply requisitions and the secondary position prepared in advance of the pass's fall, about Judith's instructions and Judith's reasoning, and the thing Judith had told him that she had never, apparently, told anyone else. She had done it, Raymond said, because she loved the king, because she had watched him plan to marry Aaron for 3 years and had genuinely believed, that Aaron was wrong for him, that the match was political rather than felt, that if the war ended badly enough, the marriage would be reconsidered. She had not, Raymond said, and he said this with the specific emphasis of a man making a distinction that mattered to him. She had not intended for Aaron to die. She had arranged for the pass to fall. She had not calculated that Aaron would be in the secondary column. Senna looked at the wall. Aunt Darian stood very still. "Where is Judith now?" he said, when Raymond had finished. "In her chambers, Your Grace. She doesn't know he's been caught." Darian nodded. He turned to Senna. He looked at the stitches. He looked at her face. "Go with Flora," he said quietly. "Stay with her until I send for you." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What needs doing?" he said, and walked out. She heard it secondhand later from Flora, who had heard it from the guard outside Judith's chamber door. He had gone alone. He had sat across from Judith in her private sitting room as dawn came through the windows, and he had told her everything he knew, and Judith had listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she had looked at her hands for a long time. Then she had said, "I would do it again. Except for Aaron. Except for that, I would do it again." And Darian had said, "I know." And then he had called the guard. Senna was sitting with Flora in the small firelit room when the attendant came to tell her the king was asking for her. She stood. Her head ached with the particular insistence Donna had predicted. She straightened her uniform. She pressed her fingers briefly against the stitches, 3 small points of pain that were also, in their way, proof. "Senna," Flora said, as she reached the door. She turned. Flora looked at her with the direct, undecorated gaze that was simply how she looked at things. "He came down that corridor at the 5th hour," Flora said. "He wasn't asleep. He wasn't nearby by accident." She paused. "I thought you should know that." Senna looked at her. "Thank you," she said. She walked out. Yet he dismissed her from the palace with 3 stitches in her head. Now she's gone, and the truth he uncovered is sitting in the council record with her father's name on it, waiting for the only person who needs to hear it. Chapter 8 is the silence after the break. Chapter 8. The silence after. She left at mid-morning. Not because he told her to leave. He had not told her to leave. He had sent for her, and she had walked toward the attendant, and then she had stopped in the corridor outside the small firelit room and stood for a moment with her hand flat against the cold wall and made a decision. She could not be in this palace when the council session happened, not because she was afraid. She had moved past afraid somewhere in the east kitchen corridor at the 5th hour, with cold marble against her cheek. What she felt now was something more structural, the recognition that if she stayed, the story of what happened at Kern's Pass would become entangled with the story of who she was and why she had come here, and those were two separate things that needed to remain separate. But her father deserved a restoration that stood on its own evidence, not on the word of a girl who had loved him. She went back to the small room. Flora was still there. "Tell him I've gone," Senna said. "Tell him the archive records are complete and accurate and Albert can confirm their integrity. Tell him Raymond's testimony is consistent with the physical documentation. Tell him he has everything he needs." Flora looked at her for a long moment. "Where are you going?" she said. "To find somewhere to wait." Senna picked up the folded paper from inside her uniform. The document she had copied from memory, her father's survey notations in her own handwriting. She set it on the chair. "Give him that. It's a record of the key findings. His men can verify everything against the original tubes." "Senna, I'm not running," she said. Because she could see Flora thinking it, the careful, intelligent eyes running the calculation. "I'm removing a complication. There's a difference." Flora looked at the paper on the chair, then at Senna. "He won't see it that way," she said. "No," Senna agreed. "He won't." She left. She walked out of Valethorn Palace through the East Service entrance at the 10th hour of the morning, carrying nothing except what fit inside her uniform. The copper pins already in her hair, her mother's ring on her right hand, the few coins she had saved over 3 years folded inside a cloth at her waist. The city of Valethorn surrounded the palace on 3 sides. Senna had been into it rarely and carefully. A market visit in the first year when she needed thread for repairs she was making to her own uniform, as a brief errand in the second year for Mistress Fran. She knew the eastern quarter well enough to navigate it and the rest of it by the logic of any city. The wider streets moved toward the center, the narrower ones moved away from it, and the edge of a city always looked like the edge of a city, regardless of which one you were in. She walked east. She found a room above a bakery on the 4th Street from the palace wall. A small room, plain, with a window that faced the alley rather than the street, and a landlady named Cindy, who asked no questions because the coin Senna offered was sufficient to make questions unnecessary. She paid for 3 days. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, another narrow bed, the third in a sequence of narrow beds that had been her furniture for 4 years, and she looked at the wall. She had done what she came to do. The evidence was in the king's hands. Raymond had spoken. Judith was in custody. The falsified dispatch would be entered into the official record, the forged seal documented, the original warnings her father had filed would be read by a council that had spent 4 years believing a different story. Her father's name would be restored. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She had planned for this moment for 4 years. She had imagined it in the specific, detailed way that people imagine things they are not certain they will live to reach. The moment of completion, the thing clicking into its correct position, the relief of the finished task. She had not imagined that completing it would feel like this, and like putting down something heavy and discovering that your arms had reorganized themselves around the weight, like standing in a room that used to be full and finding it very, very quiet. On the first day, she slept. Not immediately. She sat with the wall for a long time first, then lay down, then slept for several hours in the flat, dense way of a body that has been refusing rest for too long and is now collecting the debt all at once. She woke in the late afternoon with her head aching and Donna's prediction confirmed and the smell of bread rising through the floor from the bakery below. She ate the meal the landlady left outside her door, bread, cold meat, a cup of something warm, and sat by the alley window and watched the light change. She thought about Darian. She had been carefully not thinking about him for 3 years, and somewhat less carefully not thinking about him for the past 2 weeks, and now, with the work finished and the distance established, she found that not thinking about him required more active effort than she had available. She thought about the cloth he had pressed against her temple with a steady hand in a cold corridor at the 5th hour of the morning. She thought about, "I'm glad you didn't leave." She thought about Flora saying he wasn't asleep. He wasn't nearby by accident. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the alley window and told herself that it did not matter. That what had happened in the war room and the memorial wing and the palace corridors was the product of proximity and crisis, and the particular intensity that crisis generated between people who were thinking clearly toward the same problem. That she had been useful to him in a specific, bounded way. That kings did not... She stopped that thought. She went back to the narrow bed and lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought instead about her father, about the village at the southern approach to Kearns Pass, about the study with its maps and its smell of old paper, about the way he had said her name, her real name, Senna Aldrich, the name that had her mother in it as well as him, with the particular quality of a man who understood that names were not just labels, but containers for everything a person was. Oh, she had not said her real name aloud since the day she forged the letter of recommendation and became Senna Vale. She said it now, quietly, in the room above the bakery. Senna Aldrich. It sounded like coming home to a house where someone was missing. On the second day, she went to the Eastern burial ground. She had known her father was buried here. She had found the record in the city archive in her first month at Valethorn, a brief administrative notation in the Register of Interred Persons. Aldrich Vile, General, executed for treason, buried in the common ground, Eastern section. The false name, even in death. The common ground, which was where they put people the city had decided did not deserve their own marked place. She had not come before. She had told herself it was because she needed to wait until the work was done. She found the section by its lack of markers, a stretch of ground between the older graves, flat and unmarked, the grass grown over it evenly in the way that time grows over everything. She did not know exactly where he was. She stood at the edge of the section and looked at the ground. Then she sat down on the grass at the border of it, the way she used to sit on the floor of his study, and she looked at the flat, unmarked earth, and she talked to him. She told him what she had found. She told him about Albert and the archive and the tubes with his handwriting inside. She told him about the falsified dispatch and the letter K and the requisition log. She told him about Raymond and what Raymond had said, and about Judith, who had done a terrible thing for a reason that was at least a recognizable human reason, even if it was not a forgivable one. She told him his name was going to be restored. She told him she was sorry it had taken 4 years. She pressed her hand flat on the grass, the same gesture she had made on the archive floor, on the survey paper with his handwriting. And she sat there for a long time while the winter light moved across the burial ground, and the city went about its business around the walls. On the walk back to the bakery room, she bought flowers from a market stall, small, plain ones, the kind that lasted in cold weather, and took them back to the burial ground and left them at the border of the unmarked section. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough, but it was what she had today. And tomorrow the record would say his name correctly, and the day after that there would be more. She walked back through the eastern quarter with her hands in her pockets, and the ache in her head reduced to a dull background complaint, and she was so absorbed in the particular quality of the city around her, the sounds, the cold air, the ordinary human business of a place that did not know or care about Kearns Pass, or falsified dispatches, or a maid with copper pins who had spent 3 years on the floors of a palace, that she did not notice the figure at the end of the street until she was nearly level with him. She stopped. He was standing at the mouth of the alley that led to the bakery, not in court clothes, in the dark, plain coat she had last seen him in on the first day in the Great Hall. No insignia, no guard. Alone. Darien. Yet he had found her. She did not know how. Flora, probably, or the landlady Cindy, or simply the organized, methodical way he moved toward problems. But he had found her, and he was standing at the end of the street looking at her with an expression she had last seen in the memorial wing. She stopped walking. They stood 20 feet apart in the middle of the ordinary city street while the people of Valethorn moved around them, indifferent. "You left," he said. "Yes," she said. "Without..." He stopped, started again. "Flora gave me your note, the summary document." His voice was even, but it had the texture of something that had been even for a long time through significant effort. The council session was at the 7th hour. The archive records were entered. Raymond's testimony was entered. He paused. Your father's name has been cleared. The decree will be public tomorrow. She breathed. The word tomorrow landed in her chest and sat there, solid and real. Thank you, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. You should have been there, he said. No, she said. It needed to stand without me. He looked at her for a long moment. The council asked who found the evidence. I told them the truth. She nodded. They'll want to speak with you, he said. Formally, as a witness to the documentation. He paused. As General Aldrich's daughter. I know. I'll come. She met his eyes. I wasn't running, Darian. His name came out the same way it had in the memorial wing. Without decision, without plan, simply because that was how she thought of him, and the distance between thinking and saying had apparently closed without her permission. As he crossed the 20 feet between them, he stopped in front of her, close, the way he had stood in the study before the attendant's footsteps arrived, and folded the moment back into its practical dimensions. There were no footsteps now. I know you weren't running, he said. I understood why you left. He looked at her face. The stitches, the bruising that had developed overnight around them, the copper pins, all of it. I didn't like it. I know, she said. I spent the session thinking about where you were, he said. I spent the afternoon looking for you. He stopped. The evenness in his voice was working hard. I am not accustomed to being in rooms where the person I need to speak with is not present. She looked up at him. What did you want to say? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not here, he said. Not in the middle of a street. He held out his hand. Come back. She looked at his hand. She thought about the narrow bed above the bakery and the 3 days she had paid for and the 2 remaining. She thought about the burial ground and the flowers at the border of the unmarked section. She thought about her father's name in a public decree, printed and sealed and entered into the record of the city that had buried him without a marker. She thought about what came after the thing you had come to do was done. She took his hand. He found her. She came back. But walking back into that palace means walking into everything that comes next, and what comes next, Senna has no map for. Chapter 9 is where he says the thing he's been carrying since the Great Hall. Chapter 9. No crown required. He did not take her back to the palace immediately. She realized this after 2 streets. They were moving east, not west, away from the palace walls rather than toward them. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the street ahead with the focused, unhurried attention he gave everything, and he did not explain, and she did not ask. He led her to a small courtyard she had not found in 3 years of careful palace-adjacent geography. A tucked, forgotten square behind the eastern market buildings, with a stone bench along one wall and a bare-branched tree in the center, and the particular quality of a place that the city had simply declined to develop further, and so had left as it was, which was quiet. He sat on the bench. She sat beside him. Not across from him. Beside him, close. And the way she had stood beside him at the stone wall, in a different kind of garden, in a story she had not yet heard about herself. The city moved around the courtyard walls. Inside the walls, it was still. Darian rested his elbows on his knees, the same posture she had seen in the memorial wing, the one that meant the thinking had gotten too large, and the formality of sitting upright was no longer serving its purpose. He looked at the bare-branched tree. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had spent 4 years being good at it. My father died when I was 23, he said, not looking at her. Looking at the tree. The fever came quickly, 3 days between his first symptoms and his death, and I had been at the northern border for 8 months, and I came back to a palace that needed a king, and a title that needed filling, and a war that needed managing, and a council that needed leading. He paused. There was no interval. Between him dying and everything being mine, there was no interval. She said nothing. I have been managing it since then, he said. The estate, the council, The wars, the alliances, the endless administrative reality of a kingdom that does not pause because its king is 23 and has not yet learned how to want things for himself without immediately converting them into a responsibility. She recognized the words. She had said something like them to him, in a different room, a different context. But the shape was familiar, and she understood that he was giving it back to her deliberately, the way you return something borrowed. "The claiming ritual," he said, "when I walked into that hall, the women in white." He was quiet for a moment. Erin wore white. On the morning she left for the Northern Front, she was going to observe the campaign. She wanted to understand what she was marrying into, she said. She said she would not be a queen who stood at a distance from the things her husband carried. He paused. She was killed in the column retreat 3 days after she arrived. Senna pressed her hands together in her lap. "When I walked into that hall and saw 7 women dressed in white, standing in a line, being offered to me like a solution to a problem," he said, "something came out of me that I had not planned. The roar, the dismissal." His jaw shifted. It was grief. I know it was grief. As it was not the women themselves, they had done nothing except arrive at an arrangement their families had constructed. It was the white. The offering, the specific quality of being told that this was what healing looked like. "It wasn't," Senna said. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." He turned to look at her. In the flat winter light of the courtyard, he looked like himself. Not the king, not the title, not the weight of the thing he had been carrying since 23, just the man underneath it. "And then I smelled something," he said. She looked at him. "I don't know how to explain it, except to say that something in me recognized something in you before my mind had caught up," he said. "Not your face, not your name, something else. The quality of how you were occupying the space, the stillness, the economy of it. Sure, the way a person is still when they are used to making themselves unobtrusive and have become very skilled at it." He paused. "I knew Erin for 3 years and she was never still. She moved through rooms like weather. I had forgotten that stillness could be its own kind of presence." Senna looked at the tree. "I didn't look for you because you reminded me of her," he said. "I need you to understand that. This is not about her. She was herself, and you are yourself, and those are separate things." He was careful about this. She could hear the care in it, the precision of a man who had thought about exactly this distinction and wanted to get it exactly right. "I looked at the corner because something in the corner was more real than anything else in that room." She thought about 3 years of floors and columns and the careful, patient accumulation of proximity. She thought about what it meant that she had chosen this particular palace, this particular position, this particular column in this particular hall, and whether the choosing had been entirely about the archive. She thought about a forged letter of recommendation and a false name, and the specific way the war room had felt, from the very first session, like a room she was supposed to be in. "I came here for my father," she said. "I know." That was real. It was the reason. "I know that too. But it was not—" She stopped, started again. "It was not the only thing that made it difficult to leave. When Judith warned me, when I sat on the bed that night with my bag half-packed," she looked at the tree. "I told myself I stayed because the truth needed delivering. That was true. Yes, it was completely true." She paused. "It was not the complete truth." He did not say anything. He waited the way she waited, the complete, unhurried patience of someone who understood that some things needed their full length of silence. "I unpacked the bag," she said, "because I could not make myself walk away from a man who said I believe you without calculating whether it was useful to say it." The courtyard was very quiet. Darian looked at her with the direct, open attention that had been making distance impossible since the 2nd week, and said nothing for a moment, because he was, she had learned, a man who needed to be certain of his words before he committed them to the air. "I have spent 9 years converting everything I want into something I'm obligated to do," he said at last. "The war became a duty." "If the council became a duty! The claiming ritual became a duty!" He turned toward her on the bench, fully, the way a man turns when he has decided that partial angles are no longer serving him. I do not want to convert this into a duty. She looked at him. I want you to stay, he said, not because the council needs a narrative, not because it would be politically useful to have the general's daughter visibly restored to standing, not because you are useful to me in the war room, though you are. He paused. Because since the day you stepped out from behind that column with your hands loose at your sides and told me you were nobody important, I have not once been in a room without being aware of whether you were in it. She breathed. I don't want the throne, she said. I'm not offering you the throne. Then what are you offering? He looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time in all her careful observation of him, she saw something on his face that was not managed, not contained, not the product of a man who had learned to keep his interior life in a separate room from everything else. He was uncertain, genuinely, openly uncertain, in the way that only people who have stopped pretending are uncertain, without armor, without calculation. I'm not certain yet, he said. I know that what I want involves you being present, physically present, in this city, in a position that is yours by right rather than by forged letter. I know that I want to continue the conversations we have been having, in the war room, in the memorial wing, in corridors at the 5th hour of the morning. He paused. I know that when I found you gone this morning, I felt something that had nothing to do with the council session and everything to do with the specific person who was absent from it. She looked at him. She thought about her father's study and the maps on the floor. She thought about 4 years of carrying a purpose that had kept her upright and moving forward in the specific way that a purpose can keep you upright. But that is not the same thing as living, and she had known for some time that she had been surviving rather than living, and had told herself the distinction could wait. She thought about the fair, unperforming face of a man who said, I believe you, and meant it without conditions. I don't know how to live in a palace, she said, legitimately, as myself. No, he said, but you know how to learn things. I have watched you learn this palace for 3 years from the floor up. You know the supply routes and the archive and the linen passage behind the east kitchen wall. Something shifted in his expression. The thing she had seen once before, briefly, when he almost smiled, but this time it completed. You know the war room better than my cartographer. She felt it land, the smile, the warmth of it, somewhere in the middle of her chest, the same place I believe you had landed, and she thought that this was becoming a pattern, and she was not opposed to the pattern. What would it look like? She said. In practical terms. If I stayed. In practical terms. He straightened slightly, and she could see him move into the register he used for logistics and planning, and she found, to her own surprise, that she loved this about him, that he could be asked a practical question and would answer it practically, without performing either sentiment or authority. Your father's name is restored by public decree tomorrow. His military record is reinstated. As his daughter, you have standing in this city that you have not had access to under a false name. He paused. That standing is yours regardless of anything else. It is not contingent on anything I offer. I know, she said. I needed you to say it anyway. Yes, he said. I know you did. They sat in the courtyard with the bare-branched tree and the city sounds beyond the walls and the winter light going slowly golden in the way it does in the late afternoon when it is about to give up on the day. There is one more thing, he said. She waited. Raymond told us something in his testimony, he said. About Judith, about her reasoning. He looked at the tree. She believed the match between Aaron and me was political, rather than felt. She believed that if circumstances changed, I would have wanted something different. He was quiet. Was she right? Senna asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The seriousness of a man who did not lie to himself about difficult things. Erin was my friend, he said finally. I cared for her. I would have honored our match completely. But Judith was not entirely wrong that there was something I had not examined closely. He paused. I had not asked myself whether I was choosing Erin or accepting the choice that had been arranged for me. Those are different questions, and I had been treating them as the same one. And now? He turned to look at her. Now, he said, I am sitting in a courtyard asking a woman who cleaned my floors for 3 years under a false name whether she would consider staying. Not as a duty, not as a political arrangement, but because I would like to know her for longer than 3 years and under better circumstances. He paused. That is not a thing I arranged. That is a thing I want. They feel different. I think they are different. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about arriving at this city with a forged letter and a purpose, and nothing else, and about what she was arriving at now, at the end of that purpose, with the copper pins and her mother's ring and 3 years of careful, patient observation that had somehow, without her full awareness, become something else as well. Ask me properly, she said. He looked at her. You told me in the study to ask you properly, he said, recalling it with the precision she had come to expect from him. When you said you didn't want the throne. Yes. And now you're asking me to ask you properly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what are you saying yes to, if I do? She considered this. To staying, she said. To the conversations. To the war room and the archive and the linen passage and the 5th hour of the morning. She looked at him directly. To finding out what this is when it's not running on crisis and documents and the 5th hour of the morning. That is what I want to know too, he said. Then ask me. He turned toward her fully. He did not perform it. And he did not frame it or construct it or arrange it. He simply said in the plain, direct voice he used for things that mattered. Will you stay? Not for your father. Not for the council record. For this. She thought about everything that had been surviving rather than living. Yes, she said. He took her hand. Not the careful, under-the-arm steadying of the corridor, not the practical steadiness of a cloth against a wound. Just her hand, in both of his, held. They sat like that in the courtyard, while the last of the winter light went gold and thin, and the city moved around them without knowing or caring that something had shifted inside the walls of a forgotten square behind the eastern market buildings, something that had no official name yet, something that did not need one today. Chapter 10. The morning after the long night. The decree went up at dawn. Senna did not see it posted. She heard it. From the window of the room above the bakery where she had spent one final night, the landlady, Cindy, having declined to refund the remaining day's payment, with the cheerful pragmatism of a woman who had not survived 30 years of commerce by being sentimental about unused nights. She heard it in the way a city hears things, not as a single sound, but as a spreading quality of noise, a change in the texture of the morning, voices carrying across the eastern quarter, with the particular energy of people who have encountered information and are processing it publicly. She lay on the narrow bed and listened to her father's name move through the city. General Aldrich Vale, formerly convicted of treason in the matter of the Battle of Kern's Pass, has been fully exonerated by royal decree. His military record is hereby reinstated in full. His name is restored to the official record of service. A public memorial will be established at the site of the Eastern Burial Ground to honor the general and all soldiers whose names were compromised by the falsification of campaign records. She had been told the language in advance. Darian had read it to her in the courtyard, from memory, because he had written it himself, rather than delegating it to the council scribes. She had listened to every word with her hand still in her lap. Now she listened to it travel across the rooftops of a city that had buried her father in unmarked ground, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and then she let herself feel it completely. The grief and the relief and the long structural ache of 4 years finally releasing their tension all at once. She gave herself until the bells rang the first hour. Then she got up, washed her face, put the copper pins in her hair, and went to the burial ground. She had brought more flowers this time, not the small, plain ones from the market stall. She had stopped at the flower seller on the corner of the 2nd Street, the one with the better stock, and spent the last of the coins from the cloth at her waist on something that deserved the expenditure. She sat at the border of the unmarked section and arranged the flowers on the grass and looked at the flat, even ground that would not be flat and even much longer. The decree had specified a memorial. And she had learned that Darian's specifications became realities with remarkable speed. "They'll put a marker here," she told the ground. "A proper one. Your name, your rank, your years of service." She set the last flower down. "I'm sorry I couldn't do it faster. I tried to do it faster." The burial ground was quiet. A groundskeeper moved in the far section, raking the winter dry grass, not looking in her direction. She sat with her father for a long time. She told him about Darian. She was not sure why, except that her father had always been the person she reported things to, the person whose opinion she sought before making significant decisions. And this felt like a significant decision, and it felt wrong not to tell him. She told him he was nothing like she had expected. She told him about the war room, and the supply routes, and the plain, direct way he said things that mattered. She told him about the corridor at the 5th hour, and the steady hand and the cloth against her temple. She told him about a courtyard with a bare-branched tree, and a man who had said, "This is a thing I want," with the specific gravity of someone who did not say that easily. She told him she thought it was real. The groundskeeper's rake moved steadily across the far section. Somewhere in the city, the decree was still traveling. "He restored your name himself," she said. "He wrote the language. He read it to me beforehand to make sure I thought it was right." She pressed her hand flat on the grass one more time. "I thought you should know that." She stood, and she smoothed her uniform, the gray household staff uniform she was wearing for the last time, because whatever she put on tomorrow, it would not be this. Because tomorrow her name would be her own name, and her standing would be her own standing, and the gray of a maid's uniform would be what it actually was, which was a costume she had worn for 3 years and could now take off. She walked back through the city toward the palace. He was waiting at the East Service entrance. Not a guard, not an attendant. Him. In the plain dark coat, no insignia, standing at the door with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a man who had calculated where she would go this morning and had decided to meet her coming back rather than waiting in a room for her to arrive. She stopped in front of him. "The burial ground," he said. Yes." He looked at her face, reading it the way he read everything, carefully and completely. "How are you?" he asked. Not "are you well?" Not the formal inquiry, the plain question, the one that meant he actually wanted to know. "Better than yesterday," she said. "Not finished yet." She met his eyes. "But better." He nodded. He held the door open and she walked through it, into the palace, through the East Service entrance she had used 100 times as a maid, and this time she walked through it as herself. The council session was at the 3rd hour. Flora came to find her beforehand, arriving at the guest room Darian had arranged for her in the residential wing, with a dress over her arm and the direct, practical expression of a woman who had decided that preparation was more useful than sentiment. "Yeah, you can't go in wearing the uniform," Flora said, holding up the dress. It was simple, well made, dark blue. "This is mine. It will need taking in at the shoulder, but there's time." Senna looked at the dress. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." Flora set it on the bed and produced a small sewing kit from her pocket, with the efficiency of someone who had anticipated this need. "Sit down and hold still." Senna sat. Flora worked quickly, the same swift, precise stitching that Senna had spent 3 years doing for other people, and there was something in receiving it that she had not expected to feel. Something about being the person whose hem was being fixed for once. Being the person that someone else was making ready. She held still and let it happen. "The council," Flora said, her needle moving. "Well, most of them received the decree this morning and have processed it. 2 of them are going to be difficult, Lord Nathan and Lord Carlton. They were both invested in the previous version of events, not because they were involved in Judith's actions, but because they built arguments on the foundation of it, and those arguments are now structurally compromised." She bit the thread. "Don't let them redirect the session toward your methods. The methods are a separate question from the evidence." "I know," Senna said. "If they bring up the false name, I'll acknowledge it and move past it." Senna looked at her. "I've been planning this conversation for 4 years." Flora looked at her steadily for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose you have." She helped Senna into the dress. It fit at the shoulder now, fitted at the waist, plain and correct. Flora looked at her with the assessing eye of someone checking a piece of work. "The copper pins," Flora said. "They stay," Senna said. Flora almost smiled. "Yes, they should." The council chamber was a long room with tall windows and a table that seated 14 and the accumulated weight of decisions that had been made in it for 3 generations. Senna had cleaned the corridor outside it. She had never been inside. She walked in as herself. 12 council members, Lord Ernest at the far end, who had the expression of a man who had revised his assessment of a situation and was not comfortable with the revision but was committed to it. Lord Nathan and Lord Carlton side by side in the middle, with the guarded, recalibrating expressions Flora had predicted. The cartographer's ink-stained successor, it's a young man named Jesse, who looked at her with open curiosity and no particular hostility, Darian at the head of the table. He looked at her when she entered, just once, directly, the same way he had looked at the corner in the great hall on the first morning. Not searching now. Finding. She sat in the chair that had been placed at the table, not at the far end, not at the periphery. At the table. She was not introduced as a maid. She was introduced as General Aldrich's daughter. The session lasted 2 hours. Lord Nathan was difficult in exactly the way Flora had predicted. He questioned her methodology, the archive access, the forged requisition letter, the time elapsed between discovery and disclosure. And he used the words agenda and manipulation with the careful precision of a man who knew he could not use stronger words, but wanted their implication present in the room. Senna answered him without flinching. She described the archive process. She described Albert's role and the intact chain of documentation. She acknowledged the forged entry letter directly. "I arrived here under a false name because my real name would have prevented me from accessing the evidence I needed to present to this council. I make no apology for the method. I make every apology for the deception to the individuals in this palace who extended trust to the name I was using." She looked at Ernest when she said it. He nodded, once, with the fractional acknowledgement of a man accepting something he found professionally uncomfortable but personally sufficient. Lord Carlton pushed on the question of her father. "The General's daughter," he said, "has an obvious interest in the outcome of this evidence review. That interest does not invalidate the evidence, but it does complicate the question of how the evidence was selected and presented." "You're right," Senna said. "It does complicate it, which is why the original documents remain in the archive, intact, in their original tubes, catalogued under their original stamps and receipt notations. Anyone at this table can verify what I found by going to look at what I found." She paused. "The evidence does not require my objectivity. It requires yours." Carlton was quiet. Jesse, the young cartographer's successor, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. The session concluded with a formal confirmation of the decree and the opening of an inquiry into the broader administrative record of the Northern Campaign, a review of what other decisions might have been made on falsified information, what other records needed examination. It was, Senna thought, the beginning of a very long piece of work. She found she didn't mind. Afterward, the council filed out in the gradual way of people who had a great deal to discuss with each other and were already beginning those discussions before they had fully left the room. Flora caught her eye from across the table and gave her a single nod, the precise economical signal of a woman who considered the outcome satisfactory and did not require further elaboration. Ernest paused beside her on his way out. "Miss Aldrich," he said, her real name, correctly, the first time anyone in an official capacity had used it. She looked at him. "The supply route correction," he said. "The Valley Road." He straightened his folio. "I have implemented it. The last 3 resupply runs have come in on schedule." He paused. "Your father surveyed that valley 22 years ago. The documentation is in the archive." He looked at her steadily. "He did good work." He walked out. She stood for a moment in the emptying chamber. Then she sat back down, alone at the long table, and looked at the tall windows and the winter light coming through them, and she let herself be still. Darian found her there. He came in after the last council member had gone and closed the door and sat down. not at the head of the table, not across from her. Beside her, the same bench geometry as the courtyard, and he set something on the table between them. A folded document. She recognized the paper. Archive paper, the slightly heavier weight that Albert used for the important files. She looked at it. "Open it," he said. She unfolded it. It was a survey notation. Her father's handwriting. She knew it in the first line, the same careful script from the Northern campaign tubes, the same letter K that had identified the forgery by its absence. It was dated 22 years ago. It was a survey of the Valley Road. At the bottom, in the margin, in her father's hand, not an official notation, just a note to himself, the kind a surveyor makes when something strikes him, were 4 words: ground holds, worth remembering. She looked at those 4 words for a long time. Albert found it this morning when the inquiry team began their review, Darian said. He thought you should have the original. She pressed her fingers against her father's handwriting. The same gesture. The archive floor, the survey tubes, the burial ground grass, and now here, her hand finding the places where he had been, pressing against them as though contact could substitute for presence. It couldn't. She knew it couldn't. But it was something. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was not steady, and she did not try to make it so. He said nothing. He sat beside her while she held the document and looked at her father's 4 words and let the full weight of the morning settle. After a while, she folded the document carefully and held it in her lap. "Ernest told me the Valley Road is working," she said. "It is. My father surveyed it 22 years ago." "Yes." "He would have found that satisfying," she said. Not the recognition, just that the road was being used correctly." She paused. He was like that. He cared more about the ground being understood than about being the one who understood it. Darian was quiet for a moment. "I know someone else like that," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the open, unmanaged expression, the one she had first seen when he almost smiled in a garden in a story she was still learning was hers, the one that had no armor in it. "I have been in this palace for 9 years," he said, "and I have not once sat at this table and felt that the right people were in the room." He looked at the table, then at her. "I would like to change that." "The council, not the council," he said. "This." He indicated the space between them, the small and specific geography of 2 people sitting beside each other in an empty room. "This room, this table, whatever comes after today, I want you at it." She looked at him. She thought about everything that had brought her here. The forged letter, the false name, the 3 years of floors and columns, and careful, patient proximity. She thought about the thing she had been surviving toward, and the thing she had arrived at instead, which was larger and less predictable, and considerably more frightening than what she had planned for. She thought about ground holds worth remembering. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He took her hand, both of his, the way he had in the courtyard, steady, present, the whole of his attention, which was the whole of him, given without management or reservation. While they sat at the long table in the council chamber with the winter light coming through the tall windows, and the city outside the glass going about its ordinary business, and the document in her lap with her father's 4 words on it, ground holds, worth remembering. The spring came 6 weeks later, not the spring of grand gestures and formal arrangements. Those would come in their own time, in the way that things between 2 people who are not in a hurry tend to come. What came first was the ordinary spring, the kind that arrives without announcement and simply begins being present, the frost retreating from the burial ground, the bare branch tree in the eastern courtyard, producing the first small evidence of intention. Senna was in the war room when she noticed it, standing at the map table, and in the middle of a conversation with Jessie about the spring survey schedule for the northern approach roads, when she looked out the window and saw the tree through the glass. Green. Just barely. Just beginning. She looked at it for a moment. Jessie said something about the survey timeline. She answered him without looking away from the tree. The door opened behind her. She knew the footsteps. "The survey schedule," Darian said, coming to stand beside her at the map table, Beside her, not across from her, the standard geography now. "How are we looking?" "6 weeks to stable ground on the northern approach," she said. "Jesse thinks we can move the first resupply 4 weeks earlier than last year if we begin the road assessment in the next fortnight." "Agreed," Darian said. He looked at the map, then at the window, and then at her looking at the window. "The tree," he said. "Yes." "It does that every year," he said. "I've never particularly noticed." She looked at him. "Notice it this year," she said. He looked at the tree. Something moved across his face, the quiet, unguarded thing she had stopped trying not to be affected by. "Yes," he said. "All right." Jesse gathered his survey notes with the tactful efficiency of a young man who had learned to read rooms and acted on that literacy promptly, and excused himself, and the war room door closed behind him. Senna and Darian stood at the map table, with the spring light coming through the glass, and the tree making its small green argument outside the window. "Flora told me this morning that she's staying," she said, "past the spring." "I know, she told me last night." He paused. She said Valethorn had more interesting conversations than anywhere else she'd been." "She meant the war room." "She meant you," he said. "Specifically." Senna looked at the map. The northern routes, the valley road, the ridge that bore her father's name. All of it known to her now, not from distance and grief and 4 years of purposeful obsession, but from standing at this table in the ordinary way of someone who was simply here, present, at work. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the Eastern Boundary Survey. The documentation is incomplete. There are sections of the approach roads that haven't been assessed since my father's time, and if we're planning to use them for spring resupply, we should know their current condition." "Yes," Darian said. "I'd like to go," she said. "Personally, to assess them." He looked at her. In the field," she said. "The way my father did." She met his eyes. "It's different from reading about ground. You know that." "I do," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll come with you." She blinked. "The king cannot simply—" "The king," he said, with the specific dry quality she had heard once or twice and found entirely disarming, "has been managing this kingdom from inside these walls for 9 years, and his terrain assessments have been consistently worse for the distance." He looked at the map. "I would like to see the ground." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. They stood at the map table together in the spring light, and outside the window, the bare-branched tree continued its small, unhurried return. The morning they left for the Eastern Survey, 2 things happened. The first, Albert came to find her in the residential corridor before dawn, carrying a leather tube, and pressed it into her hands with the precise, unhurried manner of a man completing a task he had been considering for some time. "The complete Northern Survey records," he said. "All of them. Your father's originals." He looked at her steadily. "They belong with his family." She held the tube. "Albert," she said. "Safe travels, Miss Aldrich," he said, and walked back to his archive. The second thing, as she came down the East Service staircase in her traveling clothes, practical wool, good boots, the copper pins in her hair, she passed Mistress Fran in the corridor. Fran stopped. She looked at Senna for a moment, at the traveling clothes, the leather tube, the copper pins, at the face she had been assigning floor assignments to for 3 years. "I always thought your work in the East Corridor was too good," Fran said. Senna looked at her. "I mean that as a compliment," Fran said, with the brisk dignity of a woman who had never in her professional life delivered a compliment without making it clear it was a professional assessment. "The marble near the column. It's held its finish better than any other section in the hall." "Thank you, Mistress Fran," Senna said. Fran gave a short nod and walked on. Senna stood in the corridor for a moment, holding her father's survey records, and felt something lighten in her chest that she had not known was still heavy. Then she went to meet the king at the East Service entrance. He was there. Plain coat, travel bag, no insignia, no guard. She had argued about the guard. Yet he had noted her argument and made his own decision. He looked at the leather tube. "Albert," she said. He nodded, unsurprised. He held out his hand. Not the formal gesture, just his hand, open, the way you offer a hand to someone you are going somewhere with. She took it. They walked out of the East Service entrance into the pale spring morning, into the city that was waking around them, into the road that led east toward the northern approach and the valley road, and the ground her father had surveyed 22 years ago and labeled, in his careful private notation, as worth remembering. She had spent 4 years in the shadows of this palace, making herself invisible, moving toward a truth that felt like the only destination. She had arrived, and then, past the arrival, past the truth in the documents and the restored name and the decree in the city's official record, past all of it, she had found something she had not been moving toward because she had not known it was possible to find. Not a throne, not a title, not a reward for the work. Just this, a road in the early morning, and a man beside her who had chosen her specifically, and her father's handwriting in a leather tube under her arm, and the particular quality of a life that was, after everything, genuinely hers. She held his hand. She looked at the road ahead. She walked.